Now, almost 2 weeks after that Malaysia airliner vanished, crews are pursuing yet another lead. And authorities say it's credible and probably the best one they have had so far. But we've heard comments like that before. And once again, satellite images have captured images of some sort of debris at sea. And this time off Western Australia in the South Indian Ocean. The two objects appear to be about 23 kilometers apart. But finding them is no easy feat. Our Kyung La is live in Perth, where it is now 7:30 in the morning. So, Kyung, not only has weather been a challenge, this is such a remote area, so there's also limited flying time, right?
There's limited flying time once they get there because it's so far away, Patricia. But before we talk a little bit more about that, I just want to join you with some news that we're getting from an Australian military official saying that the two planes that were scheduled to take off from this airbase, they have indeed taken off. Now, we don't they're scheduled to take off. I'm going to backtrack that. They were scheduled to take off. So the understanding is that they are going to leave from this airbase and they are going to head to this area, which is about 3.5 to 4 hours away. This is a remote area, and they only have just a couple of hours above this region. And this area, even though on the graphics it looks like it's shrunk considerably from where it was, it's still a large area. New Mexico or Arizona, that's the size of the area that they have to scope out. So only a couple hours there, and then those planes have to make that long journey back here because it is so remote. Now, it's not just Australia. New Zealand is joining in the search, as well as the United States, and there are some cargo vessels in that area that are also going to help by sea. So a number of efforts just to try to get down there and try to figure out exactly what this debris is. And Patricia, we should point out that when you speak to officials here in Australia, they say they want to find it. They want to do their best effort to get to it, to locate it. But at the same time, they're dialing back expectations and making sure people know they don't know what it is yet. Patricia?
And Kyung, we know that weather was certainly, a factor yesterday. The rain contributing to low visibility. What are the weather conditions there today?
The weather conditions actually have improved considerably from about an hour and a half ago. About an hour and a half ago, it was almost hurricane-type conditions, rain, wind. It was coming down sideways. But now it's certainly cleared up. We're not seeing any rain anymore. There is some cloud cover, but it's just a gloomy day. So it does seem like planes could take off as scheduled from this airbase.
That's good to hear. At least we're getting a break on that front. Now, these satellite images are 4 days old. I imagine it takes a while to go through these images.
You're right. I mean, think about the size of the Indian Ocean, and mathematically, again, they have narrowed it down to this one area, but they have to go through these images piece by piece, and it takes a long time to go through that data, especially when you think about, the number of images that might exist in that one space. So it does take time, and even though these images were taken several days ago, it takes time for the experts to pore through it and to look at it and then to release it.
Now, we know there was a Norwegian cargo ship that continued the search overnight because the air search was called off for darkness. Now, there are more ships headed this way, correct?
Yes, you're right. Those are the cargo vessels, the private vessels that are down in that area or near that area. What the Australian government did, the military did ask that if there are any private cargo vessels or government-affiliated vessels down there to try to steam down that area. An interesting story that we are hearing about the Norwegians is that particular vessel, because the air search is so limited, the daylight only lasts so long, they actually stayed up through the night. The sailors were on the decks using binoculars and lights just to try to go through that area and try to basically check off whatever space they could as they go back and forth through this region.
All right, we hope that we get some answers today. Thank you so much for that update. Kyung La, live for us from Perth. Now, yet another theory has emerged that could explain why and how the plane went down. CNN national correspondent Suzanne Malveaux explains what is behind the so-called zombie scenario.
October 25, 1999, a chartered Learjet carrying professional golfer Payne Stewart and 5 others plunged nose first into a South Dakota field. It had streaked across the sky for almost 4 hours, flying on its own. The plane had lost cabin pressure, and all on board were dead. Jet fighters shadowing the plane could do nothing to save it, as it eventually ran out of fuel. Could Malaysia Flight 370 have also turned into a so-called zombie plane?
They were at some point overtaken by whatever it was, smoke, fire, or some kind of problem, and the plane was then left to fly itself. That's what we call the zombie option.
It happened with Helios Flight 522, which flew on autopilot for nearly 2 hours before crashing outside Athens in 2005. Pilots forgot to turn the pressurization switch from manual to auto. At 34,000 feet, all 121 on board passed out and froze in their seats. So far, we know the Malaysian flight was flying for at least 7 hours based on pings or signals emitted from the plane. Clive Irving believes whatever took out the plane's transponder and communication systems, ACARS, was mechanical and could have also damaged the plane's electronic nerve center, which, among other things, monitors the cabin's climate.
In the case of oxygen shortage, where you have a decompression, it happens pretty quickly. It can happen in a minute or so. In the case of smoke, it could also be very quick. The pilots have a greater oxygen supply than the passengers do, so they could have remained active for longer. But all of this could have taken no more than, say, 10 minutes at the most.
Skeptics say the zombie scenario is highly unlikely for the Malaysian flight because of the behavior of the plane and crew.
You're changing altitudes because you're coming down to land safely, and you're changing direction, and you're changing heading. And professionally, and by training, you would let somebody know, air traffic control. So an emergency signal would have been broadcast.
It may be that they did try to send a signal, and there was, for some technical reason, the signal was never sent. Or it may be that the signal was sent and no one was listening. This was like 1:20 in the morning over the Pacific.
In the case of Payne Stewart's crash, investigators found no distress call was made either, just a sounding of alarms, including one for a loss of cabin pressure. What is behind the credibility of the zombie plane theory is whether or not you believe this is an investigation into a mechanical failure of this Malaysian flight or an investigation into a criminal act, whether the crew switched off these aircraft systems or they just failed, giving everyone on board little time to respond or survive. Suzanne Malveaux, CNN, Washington.
After nearly 2 weeks of waiting desperately for word, families of passengers and crew to board the missing airliner reacted to news of a possible debris sighting. Pauline Chu reports from Beijing.
It's been an excruciating time, this endless waiting period. It's not easy when Malaysian authorities say the information that families want is information we don't have. Now, earlier we had that news conference out of Australia. I was in the ballroom of the Lido Hotel here in Beijing where relatives were watching that in Chinese translation. The atmosphere was tense. Relatives were sitting up straight, leaning forward, hanging on to every word, absorbing every detail about this potential debris. Now, after the news conference, we spoke with Mr. Wen. His only son was on that flight, and here's what he had to say about those developments.
This is not confirmed. I think this is definitely not the plane. I have hope. From the very beginning, I firmly believe that everyone on board is alive. I'm just not sure where they have hidden the plane.
So as you heard, some relatives are really hoping for a miracle. Now, a message wall has gone up in the hotel, and in just a couple of hours, it was covered with messages. One person said, "Dad, we're waiting for you to come home for dinner." Now, relatives have been traumatized by this endless experience, and they are just hoping for some sort of shred of concrete information, something to maybe give them a little hope. Pauline Chu, CNN, Beijing.
As Pauline just said, some of those family members still hoping for a miracle, and many have found it hard to believe that so many of those family members still believe their loved ones are alive. But our Eyes Just to Say spoke earlier with a psychologist, Eric Fisher, about what these families might be going through and what's going through their minds.
Until you have absolute proof, you don't want to give up on the idea that someone you care for
Because it's
is
like
dead.
you're giving up on them,
Right.
in fact.
And the guilt that comes with it. What if you find out they're alive or something could have been done and you gave up? That survivor's guilt that someone would experience from that of having given up hope is just unimaginable. So they probably have their inside, you know, we have our real, feel, and ideal selves. Our ideal is the one we show the world. The ideal self is saying, I want them to be alive. Part of their real self is saying, but I kind of hope we can get closure because this is so painful and I don't know I can live.
I want to talk about the cultural aspect of all of this,
Right.
specifically the way Asian cultures deal with expressing their emotions. Talk to me about how that is feeding into what we're seeing.
Well, they're very kind of closed emotionally. They try to deal with logic and work with logic, and when grieving happens, the grief comes out. They express that grief very openly, but there are periods of time that they're supposed to grieve. They're almost rituals that they have that they experience in grief. So the difficulty is, when do I start grieving? When am I allowed to grieve? And if I grieve too early, am I going to look weak, or how am I going to be perceived? But the whole swell of emotion here is just overwhelming. So I don't say there's a right or wrong way how to do it. We feel and we express those feelings. The other issue I have culturally is that China has their one-child rule. And, you know, you have a child and you don't know if they've had other children that they had to give up or lost in other ways. So they've lost who they put their whole life into and their legacy towards, that child's gone now.
An excruciating time as Aisha Sasay speaks with a psychologist about what the families are going through. Stay with CNN Newsroom. We still have much more to come after this break.